Black American slave masters. In Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia, free blacks own more than 10,000 slaves, according to federal census of 1,830. Many of the black masters in the Lower South were large planters who owned scores of slaves and planted large quantities of cotton, rice, and sugar cane. In 1860, August Donato, a free colored planter of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, owned 70 slaves who worked 500 acres of land and produced 100 bales of cotton. About 600 miles to the east of Louisiana in the county of Sumter, South Carolina, William Ellison, a free colored planter, used the labor of 70 slaves to cultivate 100 bales of cotton in 1861. In South Carolina, Robert Michael Collins and Margaret Mitchell Harris used their slaves to till the soil of Santee Plantation and grew 240,000 pounds of rice in 1849. The large majority free colored planters lived in Louisiana and planted sugar cane. In 1860, Madame Ciprien Ricard and her son Pierre Ricard of Ibeville Parish owned 168 slaves. The joint operation of mother and son used the labor of slaves to produce 515 hogsheads of sugar in 1859. Not all free black masters were from the South. In fact, the city of New York had 8 black slave owners who owned 17 slaves in 1830. The institution of black slave owning was widespread, stretching as far north as New York and as far south as Florida, extending westward into Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri. How did black American slave ownership begin this country? During the 17th century, as early as 1619, colonization efforts, indentured servitude, and fragile peace treaties with local indigenous tribes began to take shape along the eastern coast of the 13 colonies. So were the demands for much-needed laborers as early colonizers sought to establish tobacco and cotton plantations in their respective colonies. By 1651, some blacks whose period of indentured service had expired were being assigned land in much the same way their white counterparts who had completed their indenture. During the first half of Virginia's existence, it had many black indentured servants, and records reveal an increasing number of free blacks. As demand for laborers began to skyrocket, colonizers also began to fall behind in satisfying the needs of the colony with Indians and indentured servants. Colonizers began to rethink and give serious thought to the idea of perpetual servitude of black slaves. By 1662, Virginia would all but end indentured servitude as statutes and slave codes became more prevalent among neighboring colonies. The status of blacks who were already there were not affected if they had completed their indenture and were free. Many were slaves who were released because of their kinship to whites, biracial, while others were emancipated for military service, militia, faithful service, or saving a life amongst other reasons. Black slave owners obtained slaves by various methods. Many inherited slaves from both black, white, and biracial relatives. A few black slave masters owned slaves in West Africa and transported their slaves to the New World. The majority of black slaveholders used their own industry and worked as artisan, entrepreneurs, and even as unskilled laborers to obtain the capital to buy slaves. The acquisition of slaves by black Americans was a result of many factors. Many free blacks bought relatives who were slaves to white masters. Quite often, marriages would occur between blacks and slaves. The free spouse attempted to buy freedom of the slave spouse and the children. There were also marriages between slaves that occasionally saw one spouse emancipated while the other remained in bondage. Some slaves' purchases were not done in the spirit of kinship, but also by humanitarian efforts. Some free blacks used their own money in efforts to purchase slaves with the sole intention of freeing them. However, many black slave masters did not intend on freeing their slaves and viewed the institution of slavery as a source of labor to be exploited for their own benefit.